Hey there, welcome to How to Ace Photography. I'm Joanne, this is lesson 3 and we're going to look at aperture priority. There are 3 times when I like to put my camera into aperture mode. When I'm using the flash, I always use aperture priority or manual. I never use shutter priority. Aperture is what determines how much of the light from the flash gets to the sensor. You can take a picture in the dark using aperture, let's say 7.1, if it's from the same distance, and you can set your shutter speed to 1/250th of a second or 1/30th of a second, and the same amount of light will hit the sensor and you will get the same picture. That's why I use aperture priority or manual mode when I'm using a flash. The closer you are to your subject with the flash, the smaller your aperture can be. That's closer to the f/16 side of the scale. If you're far away, you need to open the aperture quite wide to something like 4.5 or 2.8 if your camera can go that low. When you set your camera to aperture priority and you're using the flash, the camera will probably set your shutter speed to about 1/60th of a second, and that works quite well in the dark. But you may want to change that up a little bit if you're doing something like a sunset picture or if you have ambient light that you want to capture. The other time that I use aperture priority is when I'm looking at my depth of field. Now the depth of field is how much of the picture that's in focus. You have a shallow depth of field if you just have your flower in focus and all the background is out of focus, and you have a deep depth of field if your whole picture is in focus. And your aperture determines the depth of field of your picture. In general, there are a few other things, but in general, it's your aperture. If you want a really deep depth of field, you need to go to the f/16 side of the scale. And if you want a shallow depth of field, you need to go more to the f/4 side of the scale. Remember, when you're taking a picture and you have your aperture set near the f/16 side of the scale, to get the correct amount of light, it's going to make your shutter speed slower and slower the closer you go to that side of the scale. So watch your shutter speed and see if you need a tripod or if you need to hold your camera really steady. You need to always have your eye on your settings. Now I may use aperture priority also when I'm shooting sports. As I said in the welcome message, I use the different modes interchangeably. So when I set my aperture to a certain amount, let's say f/7.1, I know that my shutter speed will be as fast as it can be. If I just set my shutter speed at, let's say, an 8/100th of a second, then I know it's not going to go lower and it's not going to get any higher. But if I want to get the highest shutter speed that I could possibly get, I may just work with the aperture side and keep an eye on the shutter speed so that it's not going too low. That way, if I have bright light or bright circumstances, I know that my shutter will remain as fast as it can possibly be under those circumstances. Well, there are the 3 situations where I usually use aperture priority. In the next video, we're going to look at shutter speed priority. So see you then. Happy shooting.